Okay, I think both of the government officials have made my job considerably easy, because I didn't, what you call, add this name from hindsight to foresight after they spoke. Obviously, whatever they have done very clearly indicates that they have had a lot of foresight before they actually entered into implementing the infrastructure. So, which actually brings me to something which probably doesn't cut your minds when you think of ICT infrastructure, because when you say ICT infrastructure, it actually conjures up visions of very high-end active elements like switches and routers and software, but very, very rarely the passive elements, which are probably something which you don't see. So it's like saying, I'll probably worry about the car that I want to drive, but not worry about so much about the road on which I want to drive the car. So catering to a network, and more so to a data center, is like what roads are to a transport system. And obviously, you know, good roads ensure smooth traffic, and therefore good cabling guarantees and error-free transmission. Now let me look at how things have changed. Now for a long time now, you know, passive infrastructure like connectivity, the physical media, and all of the build-out was considered as actually a distraction from an IT infrastructure specialist. And all these decision makers were primarily concerned with things like BSS, OSS, and a whole lot of active elements that goes into the network. Now, in this context, if you actually look at the government priorities, there's more and more governments which are focusing on improving services to citizens, to non-citizens, to businesses like us, and also, as Madam Shah referred to, internal civil servants, by leveraging the country's ICT capabilities and making it more efficient and reliable. Now, as this happens, it needs to complement more and more intergovernmental services efficiently, because government wants to extend what you call a single consolidated face to the user across multiple services. And so the networks will need to be more transactional, probably more multilingual and diverse, as opposed to data centers or networks that many of us use within our boundaries of a company or an enterprise. So this proactive model is actually driven by very high user expectations, ever-reducing costs, which I believe is certainly applicable even to the governments, and as a necessity to maintain a very high service level, which is actually what makes the user, like a common citizen, perceive this as a government efficiency. It's the experience of going onto the network and achieving what they want to do, which makes them perceive how efficient the government is. In other words, I think networks and data centers need to do more with less. Now, in this scenario, the peripheral infrastructure, which was once considered as a distraction, I think is now turning to be more critical, with a high reliance on specialist partners and vendors, and hence demanding probably more serious attention and understanding by the IT decision makers. And when it comes to mission-critical data centers, it even extends into the realms of what I would believe as facility management. So what you see here as a survey result, which was conducted by one of the foremost magazines, with professionals who actually make decisions, you know, people like the decision makers from the government are responsible. And what they have stated is that reducing costs is the most critical business priority, and networking, voice, and data communications is the second most critical technology priority. And from this context, I think the return on investment, especially in a data center, is not just a dimension of upfront costs, but instead the total costs of ownership. Now, on the one hand, consolidation and virtualization, which some of my other speakers will probably dwell on, will increase the useful work performed in the data center. On the other hand, as Madam Shah referred, is bound to create more heat and hence increase probably your electricity cost. Now, in a typical data center, in terms of the total cost of ownership, approximately half of the lifetime per rack TCO, which is maybe about $100,000 to $120,000, is capital expense. And the other half is an operating expense. Now, as you can see from the slide, the cost breakdown, the highest of 20% is actually towards electricity. Now, one could classify the key infrastructure in a data center into 5 categories. I think it was dwelled upon by Madam Verma too. You have the physical security and fire protection installations, you have the power and cooling, you have other structural infrastructure, you have the active components, and last but not the least, my favorite subject, which is the cabling and racks. Now, although you may not suspect it, in a high-density data center, there is a lot that cabling and rack designs play towards power and cooling efficiency, and therefore, the total electricity costs. Let me highlight this by focusing on simply 3 very important principles in designing the data center. The first one is the principle of deciding the right amount of space. I couldn't agree with the earlier speakers more. I think you will need to provide for adequate empty floor space to enable future reallocation and adding new racks as needed. You will need to provide for probably ample overhead space, underfloor cable pathways, and trough spaces for future growth and manageability. I think you need to remember that expanding a physical space of an existing data center is probably going to be more costlier than the original build cost itself, and I think she referred to that in her speech. The second is the principle of reliability. Depending upon the mission criticality of a data center, downtime in some businesses can be even as high as about $6 million an hour if you're a global financial enterprise. However, from a citizen's perspective, it is probably more a question of governing efficiency rather than money. Now, that reliability factor is actually determined by the flow of data without errors, and I think if you have more errors, it costs more retransmissions, and that actually brings down the speed of the network. Besides other factors, there are a whole lot of sets. There is also this retransmission and delay in the network is actually also caused by the quality and the standard of the cabling system. And the last is, of course, the manageability. An organized and unified cable management system helps easy location and access for reconfiguration. It reduces the downtime and therefore lowers the operational cost. Now, as you can see on this slide, on the right-hand side of this picture, disorganized cabling, which is caused by poor design and poor installation practices, leads to obstructions to airflow, which thereby increases the heat and therefore drives more cooling and finally more electricity costs. Besides, going forward, I think data centers will need to meet the so-called green requirements or green data center requirements from LEED certification and those dimensions. So because of the extensive swapping of data, which is probably caused on account of the virtualization and consolidation, these machines in the data centers will require to run very, very efficiently. In other words, the stressed network physics should not impact the data transmission, and at the same time, it should also aid better cooling and therefore lower OPEX cost. So there is more at risk, in my opinion, than before if cabling reliability in design is not established and it is not guaranteed. To begin with, doing it right the first time, and this is when I think the data center building in terms of foresight, in terms of design and deployment needs to be considered. And as a closing note, it's really pertinent to remember that the life of a cabling system needs to surpass the life of other infrastructure by at least 2 times. But in terms of infrastructure cost, it's probably much less compared to the other elements. And typically, in terms of troubleshooting, fault management at the physical layer actually takes much more time to resolve. So clearly, I think with a little bit of foresight, one could avoid repenting in hindsight. So that's my message, ladies and gentlemen. I'll see you at the question time.